Hello, and welcome to the fourth pre-record for Britain, a Racial Nation module. This one's going to be a little bit shorter than usual simply because I'm outlining the next 2 weeks, and one of those weeks is going to be one-on-one, so it's going to be a little bit shorter. Very quickly, just to confirm what we talked about in class last week about how the next 2 weeks are going to work. On the 29th, next week, I am going to be introducing you to the field of Atlantic history. So, the study of the countries that border the Atlantic. So, we're not just going to be focused on England like what we did with the week about the Crusades. We're going to give a bigger scope so we can work out how that's impacting England, English society, nationalism, and racism. Because it's really in the mid to late 15th century and onwards that we start to see really fixed and changed racialized attitudes having a major effect in England. So it's arguable that before the kind of early modern period, culture and religion were bigger factors, but England entering the Atlantic market, the West African slave trade, and colonization completely transforms everything. So we need to look at what is happening throughout the Atlantic as a whole to understand how that impacts England. So next week we're looking at the concept of Atlantic history. The week after, on the 6th of December, make sure you book one-on-ones with me. And before the end of next week, send me as detailed plan as you want, as in structure, what you're going to include, what kind of sources you're looking at. So don't just send me that 20 minutes before your one-on-one so we can properly have a look. And when we go into the one-on-ones, we can discuss your plan in detail and make sure you're on track to get the best score possible for the essay, which is being handed in the week after the 6th of December. So, before you come to the seminar next week, I want you to have read the introduction to this book. So it's a book by Philip D. Morgan and Jack P. Green called Atlantic History, A Critical Appraisal. It's basically an introduction into studying Atlantic history, the pros and cons of studying Atlantic history. And I want you to read the introduction chapter of this. It's available on Google Books via a preview. So if you just go on Google the title of this book, you can go and read the first chapter of it. Think about what they're saying. What are the uses of Atlantic history? What are the weaknesses of Atlantic history? We're going to be discussing this in detail at the start of the lecture next week. So make sure you've got that done. Give yourself enough time to read that full chapter because it's really important you understand some of the processes that are happening throughout the Atlantic world, which is all the countries that border the Atlantic. So West Africa, Britain, the Iberian Peninsula, North America, Latin America, and South America. What is going on there? You get emerging systems such as slavery, mercantilism, and early globalization. And there's definitions of those things in there. So make sure you understand what Atlantic history is before we begin the lecture next week, because we can't understand what happens in England without understanding what's happening throughout the Atlantic. And then we're going to basically run through five major things once we've looked at kind of what Atlantic history is. We're going to begin one with the internal colonization of the UK. We often think of England, when we think of the British Empire and Britain colonizing the rest of the world, we really are referring to the English Empire. And people often forget that the first countries that are colonized by England are Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. So Ireland is often referred to as kind of the colonial laboratory. This is where England basically practices its techniques that it uses in India, and North America, Africa, and the Pacific Islands much later on. So think about um, what happens between England and Ireland, and Cromwell in particular, who brutalizes the local population of Ireland. Think about what King James does in Scotland, introducing his version of the Bible, and the brutal oppression of the Celtic groups in Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. In Wales, using the Welsh language is made illegal until way into the early 20th century. So England dominates the Celtic countries of the rest of what becomes the UK one day. So we'll be talking about that in more detail. And through that, we can see that religion is important, but cultural differences are massively important as well. Then we're going to be thinking about why England and other countries in Europe begin to cross the Atlantic. So, for most of the medieval period and before, England had basically traded with North Africa, European countries, the Middle East. Even though it was at war for a long time during the Crusades, the trade with the Middle East and further along to the east. So Britain mainly traded with along those Silk Roads. What happens at the end of the 15th century is all these European countries start to cross the Atlantic to see what's going on there. Now, there are a couple of reasons for this, which we'll go into more detail about in the lecture, including classic things like money, wanting to spread Christianity, what natural kind of inquisitive nature about what is over the Atlantic, personal gain and glory. But one of the most important events, and one of the most important events in human history, or certainly European history, um, is the 1453 siege of Constantinople by the Ottoman Turks. When Constantinople falls, so the old heart of Christendom in the east, when that is taken over by the fourth Islamic Caliphate, the Ottomans, England and the rest of Europe loses its access to the Silk Roads in the East. Trade becomes a problem. And as we discussed last week, after the crises of the 14th century in medieval Europe, they need to get the economies going again. So, as they can't go east, there's only really one direction they can go in, and that is west. So, we'll be talking about 1453 siege of Constantinople and the other reasons why people might have crossed the Atlantic, including these early Atlantic explorers, which is the third major thing we'll be talking about in the lecture. You will, of course, be familiar with Cristoforo Columbus. So, of Christopher Columbus as the non-Anglican, as the Anglicanized version of his name is. But there are other really important early explorers who have a massive impact when they arrive in the New World. You have Cabot and Hans Staden, who are names you possibly have heard of, but if not, go and have a look at those two names that I've highlighted on point three, because I'll be bringing both of them up. What is their significance? What was the relationship between these early explorers in the Atlantic and the natives in North and Latin America? Columbus at first has quite a good relationship with the people. How and why does that change? Columbus and people like Hernan Cortez basically introduce a system called the encomienda system, which is basically they tell the natives that they will protect them, and in exchange the natives work for them. They give them gold, they give them valuable resources that they can send back to Europe. This begins an uneven trade dynamic that has never really changed since, and they're able to exploit a lot of the native populations who are technologically inferior to the Europeans. And many of these early natives see Columbus and Staden as almost religious deities. So when you have that dynamic, why does it change? How does slavery emerge? And what is England's role in all this? The early colonial powers are Portugal and Spain. They go and invade and dominate much of Central and Latin America, killing millions of people intentionally and unintentionally. So, through biological warfare, basically, um, 20 million people die in Mexico because of common cold, sexually transmitted diseases. And as a result of this, the people in Latin America just don't have the antibodies to survive the diseases Europeans bring. So, what is the impact of that moving forward? It's important for you to think about that. We'll be discussing it more in the lecture. And so that's what happens at first with Spain and Portugal. Britain, France, and the Netherlands kind of emerge as the second wave of colonizers, and they are really more focused on North America than Latin and South America, although they do end up in the Caribbean as well. England famously lands on the east coast of America, and establishes the 13 colonies along the eastern starboard. France is further north of that in Canada. So, what is the relationship between these different countries, which again fuels the nationalism that kind of emerged in the medieval period, especially after the Hundred Years' War? Nationalism has formed in Europe, race is forming as a concept in Europe, and now they're traveling across the Atlantic and exporting these ideas and meeting natives, and eventually, of course, having conflict with natives. So that's what we're going to be talking about the lecture. Have a think about some of the questions I've raised. Have a look at some of those names, and we'll be talking about that on Monday. So thanks a lot, and I will. If you have any questions before then, please just get in touch with me, and I'll see you Monday.